What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so we are jumping into our first story of Marvel Legacy, which, is appropriate that it's Amazing Spider-Man. Spider-Man, dude, it's interesting to me when it comes to comic books because, honestly, I would consider Spider-Man to be like the third most popular superhero in existence, who's, basically falls behind like Superman is number one and Batman is number two. But Spider-Man is like the face of Marvel. And so it's so interesting because it's like the character from Marvel Comics that everybody knows. It's really kind of wild here. But there is a lot of history here. There is a lot of stuff that goes into this in terms of the Spider-Man legacy, things like that. Now, as I've always stated, I am not the expert on Spider-Man. Sal with Comic Pop knows probably more about comics than I'll ever know, but he certainly knows more about Spider-Man than I'll ever know. So it's kind of crazy. But with this whole thing, it is really interesting because this really comes as the aftermath to Secret Empire. Remember, when it comes to Marvel Legacy, it's sort of like Marvel's DC Rebirth in a lot of different ways. You had the Marvel Legacy one-shot, you had the Generations tie-ins, and all the Generations tie-ins were designed to do was basically tell us what happened in Secret Empire when Captain America wiped everybody away from existence using the Cosmic Cube. The Generation stories is what they were doing. Marvel Legacy number 1 is basically what sets everything in motion in terms of the Marvel Legacy line of stories. And so this basically comes out of Secret Empire and all the things that took place from All New, All Different Marvel up until this point. Now, for the character of Mockingbird, for the character of Bobby Morse, essentially what happened with her, she was just a long-time member of the Marvel community who just kind of had minor roles here and there. She was part of the Avengers for a little while, she was involved in S.H.I.E.L.D., and that was really about it. I think one of the biggest moments with her character came in All New, All Different Amazing Spider-Man. Part of it was because of the fact that she and Peter Parker worked together so often, but also because of the fact that she was introduced, or at least kind of brought in, as a new love interest for Peter Parker. But one thing to keep in mind, and even one of the things that's talked about here, is that he's basically just kind of crashing with her. He's basically hanging out with her, just because of the fact that he doesn't really have a home of his own. And this all comes out of Secret Empire, the collapse of Parker Industries. Now, for those of you guys who are getting into Marvel Legacy, or really getting into Marvel for the very first time, by way of Marvel Legacy, Parker Industries was basically a concept that was launched by Dr. Octopus when he took over the body of Peter Parker. And again, that's all in the Amazing Spider-Man playlist. You're welcome to go back and watch it all. But the whole idea here was that there was basically a point where Dr. Octopus was dying. And in order to keep himself alive, he had devised a sort of device of sorts that would allow him to basically take over the mind of Peter Parker. Now, over the course of the Amazing Spider-Man line of stories, running up to like Suicide Run and different things like that, it was essentially Dr. Octopus finally taking over the body of Peter in its totality, or at least that seemed to be the case. Peter was residing in the background, but he didn't really have any control anymore. One of the things that Dr. Octopus had done was basically begin the process of sort of building up this massive legacy. In the mind of Dr. Octopus, he was going to stay in the body of Peter Parker forever until, the body of Peter Parker died. And so in order to ensure that he made the most of the experience, he began basically putting his mind to task and developing a litany of different things. Now, a lot of this was just various technological gadgets that would make his life easier as Spider-Man, but the biggest part of it was Parker Industries. And Parker Industries, eventually just kind of became this massive conglomerate. Now, the problem with this is we don't really know how. We basically had Parker Industries being formed by Dr. Octopus. It was a very fledgling thing. And then we skipped ahead 8 months and suddenly it was this massive conglomerate and there was no real explanation in terms of how it got there. But the idea was that with Peter Parker getting his body back, he was basically running Parker Industries as the CEO. The problem with this was that with Dr. Octopus having been defeated, having been cast out of Peter's body, he basically resigned himself to the body of a machine, kind of lying in wait, waiting for his chance to strike again. And so what ended up happening is during All New, All Different Amazing Spider-Man, running up to a story called Clone Conspiracy, Dr. Octopus remained in the background. And because Clone Conspiracy was basically a story that dealt with the return of Ben Reilly, who was basically cloning all these different people who had died over the course of Peter's life, Dr. Octopus created a new body for himself. And when he did, he returned as Superior Spider-Man. And so what ended up happening is this went directly into Secret Empire, and it basically led to Dr. Octopus and Peter Parker fighting, Peter Parker realizing there was no way to defeat Dr. Octopus, or at least keep Parker Industries, with the exception of hitting a doomsday button. And so what he basically did was destroy Parker Industries. He basically implanted a sort of virus that went out to all the webware technology they had, everything that everybody owned, phones, tablets, and basically just destroyed everything. And so Parker Industries stock just absolutely crumbled. The company was virtually worthless, and this left Peter Parker back where he was before it all started, essentially being broke again. And so what this story is designed to do is sort of bring us back to that familiarity, bring us back to the Peter Parker that we remember, and basically take him back to the guy who's barely making ends meet. A lot of people wanted to see Peter as the struggling kid. That was just kind of a mainstay of his character. You know, Peter Parker was Spider-Man. He'd go out, he'd save the day. He was one of the smartest men on the planet, but when the mask came off and the costume went into the closet, he was a guy who was barely able to pay rent. It really humanized his character in a lot of ways. And so bringing it back to these things, basically having him in a situation where Bobby Morse has a refrigerator full of food and all of it says, if this is not Peter Parker's, you cannot eat any of this, it's pretty intriguing. Now from here we switch over to Harry Osborn. And one thing to keep in mind is Harry Osborn has a very long, very tenuous, and in a lot of ways very tangled history in Marvel. Of course, as the son of Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, Harry Osborn became the Green Goblin somewhere along the line, but his path has largely been one of redemption in Marvel in recent years, in the sense that he's basically trying to go back to being a good guy. He's basically returned to being one of Peter Parker's closest friends. And so in this instance, what he's actually done is gotten back together with a girl named Liz Allen. But Liz Allen was basically a longtime member of the Spider-Man family. And when I say the Spider-Man family, I'm referring to people who were there at the beginning of the Spider-Man comics. Gwen Stacy, Mary Jane Watson, Harry Osborn, Norman Osborn, people who have been around there since the beginning, who have been in Marvel Comics, you know, for almost 60 years, 70 years, and have all been a part of this Spider-Man mythos. Their roles have changed, but at the end of the day, they're still there. This whole idea with Harry is that he's basically operating as the kind of guy who's essentially picking up the pieces. Where Peter Parker was the former CEO and where he's basically just sort of collapsed into himself, Harry Osborn is the one that's doing what Peter Parker should be doing, in the sense that Harry Osborn's basically organizing for the sale of various assets of Parker Industries in an effort to basically satisfy the various lawsuits that have been filed against him. But the other half of this is that with Peter, it's dealing more with the public backlash as opposed to anything else. Because of the fact that he used to work at the Daily Bugle and because Robbie Robertson was one of the long-standing members who was always in Peter's corner, when this situation unfolds, Peter's reading all these articles from the Daily Bugle where they're basically lambasting him, calling him a failure, saying he's a guy that just collapsed in on himself. For him, it's almost a personal violation considering that him and Robbie Robertson were friends for so long. But one thing to keep in mind is that with Robbie Robertson, he was always the middle of the ground guy. It was always, let's tell the story with the facts, let's not put a slant on it. And so because of this, with Peter Parker showing up and saying, why are you creating, why are you writing all these articles about me? Robbie Robertson's response is, because it's true. Because you were a guy who was in no position to run a multi-billion-dollar industry. You didn't go to college and major in business management. It was just kind of given to you. And you did what almost anybody does when they get something they don't earn. They squander it in its entirety. And so because of this, Peter's response, and that's kind of the interesting thing, Peter's response behind the scenes is he was doing everything that was right. And that's why this story is so cool, because it gives us these sort of different perspectives in terms of how all this unfolds. In Peter's mind, he destroyed Parker Industries in order to keep it from falling into the hands of Dr. Octopus, who would have done God knows what with it. With Robbie Robertson, all he sees is the front side. Peter Parker was running a corporation. Peter Parker wasn't ready for it. Peter Parker ran it to the ground. End of story. And so it's kind of interesting, with regards to these two diametrically opposing views on the same thing coming from two different perspectives. But the way that Peter basically hits home with Robbie Robertson and the idea that he could go back to work at the Daily Bugle is when one of their guys is going through their whole science section and basically typing up an article that the average person wouldn't even begin to be able to understand. Peter's response is, no, here's what you have to do, here's what you have to say, and here's the way that you do it in an easy to understand way. Robbie Robertson immediately picks that up, and it just kind of occurs to him, this is the job for Peter Parker. And so at this point, we kind of continue the idea of this aftermath. Peter Parker walking through the streets, Peter Parker basically being mobbed by people who were angry, and rightfully so, because Parker Industries employed millions of people. Not only that, there were millions and millions of other people who used, Parker Industries products. Now, some of this was people who basically had stock in the company, who lost a lot of money when it went under. And so in light of this, these people who are freaking out are coming from different perspectives. For other people, it's something as small as the idea that all their wedding photos were basically backed up to the Parker Industries cloud, and they're all gone now. Moments in time that they will never get back are gone forever. So the collapse of Parker Industries impacts the general public in a variety of ways, financially, emotionally, with regards to their own personal histories, different things like that. It's a pretty big deal, and it's pretty massive. And so in order to cheer him up, what ends up happening is Bobby Morse actually grabs him and says, let's just go out on the town. Let's just go out and have some fun, and let's just kind of be superheroes for the night. And this is cool. This is really interesting. It's one of the things that I like about this. When you read or when you think about Amazing Spider-Man Legacy, your first thought is, okay, we're going to jump right into it. We're going to start a story. There's going to be all these things going on, and Peter Parker's going to be Spider-Man. But that was one of the big mistakes of like all new, all different Marvel. It was immediately jumping in and then just setting everything up for some great big huge story, jumping into the middle of a story. When it comes to characters, people need to be eased eased in, especially with somebody like Spider-Man, who's wildly popular, but has such a convoluted history. And that's why this is cool. It's getting back to familiarity. It's getting back to that history that people are so familiar with. That's why I would say Amazing Spider-Man Legacy is probably a shot in the nostalgia for a lot of people who have been reading Spider-Man for a very, very long time, because they're seeing all these callbacks to stories that they read 20 years ago, 25 years ago, maybe even 30 years ago if they're old enough to have been reading that long. But the other half of this is the public perception of Spider-Man versus Peter Parker, where a lot of people associate Spider-Man with Peter Parker because of the fact that under Parker Industries, Spider-Man was the bodyguard of Peter. People also recognize that he is a hero, and it's one of those things where they just kind of give him a pass. Where the anger is there, where the irritation is there, Spider-Man swinging in, saving the day, he's doing what he's always done, and that's why it's cool. Again, the return to this whole familiar thing. And so following this, we basically pick up in the aftermath, which is to say Peter basically sitting down alongside Norman Osborn, the various people who have filed lawsuits against him, people who were employees, people who bought Parker Industries products, and essentially issuing an apology. The crazy thing about this is that an apology from a former CEO who in the public eye tanked the company and cost people boatloads of money and personal items, personal backups, does little to console their emotions, to console their anger and their irritation. And so while Peter Parker is just like them, just the average person trying to make their way in the world, at the end of the day, they're angry and they want to vent that anger at someone, rightfully so or unrightfully so. But regardless of the circumstance, while Peter Parker walks out of this meeting, there's people who are picketing, people who are protesting, the whole 9 yards. He just really kind of bails out and he just really sort of takes off. Now at this point, we switch over to a guy named Clayton Cole. Clayton Cole was basically a guy who was just a super genius. But the funny thing about this is that where he was a villain that kind of appeared periodically in the realm of Marvel Comics and the Spider-Man stories, during the events of Civil War II, when you had the Inhuman Ulysses who had these glimpses of the future, his idea was basically he saw a future where Clayton Cole would attack Peter Parker. It wasn't the biggest thing in the world, it wasn't a world-shattering event, but Peter Parker, realizing this was the case, decided to give Clayton Cole a second chance, see if he could steer him away from this path where he becomes a villain, not by locking him up, but by giving him a chance to express his creative juices in terms of, his scientific prowess. The problem with this is that with the collapse of Parker Industries, everything Parker Industries owned, as well, including the Baxter Building where they took up residence, is being liquidated, it's being sold. And so in the mind of Clayton, he's basically organizing this massive attempt to break into the Baxter Building, steal everything that belongs to them, and then sell it, which is not necessarily wrong. Now, under the contract that, Clayton Cole signed working for Parker Industries, anything he creates is the property of the company. So technically speaking, the company's selling off its own assets, but the company was made successful by the people who built it. And so if you're Clayton Cole and you're sitting down and you realize everything Parker Industries owns is being sold off, including the things that you created, while you weren't responsible for the destruction of Parker Industries, at the end of the day, the things you created, the things that are part of who you are, your heart and soul, so to speak, it's just kind of being sold off to the highest bidder because the person who owned the company screwed up. So again, a lot of personal emotions in this. Because this is also the Baxter Building, Johnny Storm steps in. Remember, following the events of Secret Wars and the launch of All New, All Different Marvel, Susan Storm, Reed Richards, Franklin Richards, Valeria Richards, the Fantastic Four, at least half the team as we knew them, was basically gone. They were nowhere to be found. The idea of Peter Parker, as under Parker Industries, buying the Baxter Building was to basically erect a statue within the building of the Fantastic Four to simply say, no one will be able to buy this building now. So when the Fantastic Four come back, I'll just give it to them. It'll be a way to basically have a keepsake for the team. Johnny Storm loved this idea, but now the tables have turned. The worst fears of Johnny Storm are beginning to come true. When the Parker Industries assets are being liquidated, the building's being sold to some condo guy who's basically just going to put a whole bunch of high-rise condos in there. It pisses off Johnny Storm because his family legacy is being sold off. So again, the aftermath, personal conflicts. And so what this does is it basically leads to Harry Osborn pointing out the fact that Clayton Cole's breaking in and they're going to just steal all the stuff, which is kind of interesting because what they end up doing is basically activating a device that has the ability to wipe out a city block if it reaches full charge. So basically it kind of brings together Johnny Storm and Clayton Cole and Spider-Man in order to essentially keep this from happening. Some of the criminals are basically wrapped up. Clayton Cole ends up making his escape at the end of it all. But again, this is all just kind of fallout. This is all aftermath. Harry Osborn gets tired of this game. He basically walks. What we end up having is Robbie Robertson offering Peter Parker a job, but not as a photographer. It's a return to familiarity, but it's also some new things. And that's the nature of doing these sort of soft reboots. Remember, Marvel never does does hard reboots. Marvel never resets everything back to square one. In this scenario, this soft reboot of sorts, this kind of revitalization, reshuffling, setting everything back to rights, it does have Peter Parker going back to his job at the Daily Bugle, but really for a guy who ran a company who helped to develop some of these extremely advanced devices, having him be a photographer would almost seem like a waste, but having him work in the science division, basically publishing articles, is actually pretty cool. So of course, once he takes this job, he ends up talking to Bobby Morse, who's basically landed a job at a place called Humanitech Robotics. Now, as far as I'm aware, Humanitech and Xander Zinn, these are new characters that have basically been thrown in. What ends up happening here is that with, Peter calling Bobby Morse and her basically telling him, look, I have the ability to get you an interview with the hottest tech company that's creating legitimate artificial intelligence, it's interesting because once Peter Parker grabs his crew and they head to Humanitech, what Peter Parker ends up realizing is that all these robots that basically are functioning under the mantle of AI are all using brain patterns. And so it's intriguing because for Peter, it's kind of like, all right, where are these brain patterns coming from? And of course, once one of the guys tries to open it up, his spider sense kicks off, Peter tries to hold the thing together, and when they're basically kicked out of the facility, Peter and Bobby Morse visit it later on that night. In the middle of investigating this whole thing, all these robots begin to start activating only for Xander Zinn to basically make his presence known and to say, if you break these things open, not only will you destroy the entire company that's been built here, everything that we've established, but you're also going to unleash a supervillain that neither of you could really hope to handle on your own. And so once they start going through and basically breaking out all these silicon matrices, they basically serve the purpose as the brain of sorts for these robots. What we end up finding out here is that inside of all these robots is a character named Quicksand. Now, a little bit of history here. When it comes to the character of Quicksand, she appeared back in Thor issue number 392. I want to say that's the case. I'm fuzzy on this. I am not 100% sure this is the case. Anyway, she's been around for a really long time. But Quicksand is basically a character where we don't really know who she is, but she's basically an answer to Sandman, to William Baker, who appeared in Amazing Spider-Man number 4. Sal over Comment Pop, tell me if I'm wrong or not. But the whole idea behind this is that with Sandman kind of standing as one of the really popular villains of the Spider-Man landscape, and because a lot of Spider-Man's rogues gallery is so iconic, because Thor was not the highest selling title that Marvel had at the time, Marvel's desire really for a lot of people who were not the X-Men or Spider-Man, their idea was to grab a lot of the villains who existed in relation to those characters, kind of rework them, and then throw them into other characters' books, and then basically give us those characters in that form. So for the character of Quicksand, she's not really composed of sand. She basically kind of manipulates particles, or at least is able to transform her body into something that's akin to sand. But regardless of the scenario, the cool thing about this is that she was basically grabbed by Xander Zinn and essentially thrown into all these different devices, all these different robots. And it kind of works because she's essentially a hive mind composed of all these different, molecular particles akin to sand. And so because of this, what it means is she could basically be broken down into little pieces, and each one is conscious in and of itself, but it's all part of a hive mind. She was basically enslaved by Xander Zinn and forced to be the AI that would allow all these robots to function and do their own thing. Now, of course, again, not a great big huge thing. And we know this because of the fact that where she goes to attack, Xander Zinn, Spider-Man steps in, says, no, you can't go around attacking people like that. You got to let them go. Do this for me. We'll call it even. And so as a result, she basically says, okay, fine, I owe you this. She ends up taking off, and Xander Zinn basically bails out as well. But again, that's the cool thing about all this. It's not designed to set the stage for these great big huge events. It's basically designed to sort of give us a return to familiarity for the character of Spider-Man. And so with this story, once everything winds down, the article that's written based on Humanitech, the rise and fall of the company, what it was that they were really doing behind the scenes in terms of what they were capable of, how their whole AI worked with regards to Quicksand, the whole 9 yards. The funny thing about this is that this is business as usual. It's not some grand, great big huge thing and everybody pats Peter on the back and says, good job, man. Take the next couple months off. You've earned it. Instead, it's what do you have for me next week? It's back to the way things always were. It's back to Peter Parker, back to business, back to the character that we're familiar with. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.